So as I said at the top, today's webinar, we're going to focus on the future impact of packaging reform on Australian brands and retailers, which is a really timely discussion because it seems like Australia's packaging reform agenda is starting to move into a more serious phase, with Minister Murray Watt indicating that reform could be announced in the coming months even. The question's starting to shift for brands and for retailers and for manufacturers from what might change to what should we be doing now. So in this session, we're going to cover why that policy is really important, what this framework is going to mean in practice for businesses, in which areas businesses are most likely going to feel that pressure, the increasing importance of packaging data and the role that that's going to play, and what brands can start to do to improve their readiness. I'd like to welcome Simon Dowding, who's our amazing guest speaker today. So Simon is the head of strategic communications and government relations at Pact Group. And I'm shortly going to hand you over to Elliot to give a little bit more of an intro to him. But Simon really works at that intersection between the political, the regulatory, and the industry. So that perspective is going to be really important to hear as we talk about how EPR is going to impact businesses. So just a quick overview on how today's session is going to run. I'm going to hand over to the big boss, our CEO, Elliot. He's going to kick us off with a short history of how Australia's arrived here to hopefully the tipping point for a national packaging reform. And then Elliot's going to introduce Simon. They're going to pick up the conversation and discuss that sort of merging of the political and regulatory landscapes, the moment that we're at now. And then they'll do a little bit of a Q&A. Ed Whitehead, our COO, is then going to jump on and talk through what packaging reform is going to mean for brands in practical terms and how they can approach their journey to packaging data readiness. And then we're going to finish with an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions that come up during the discussion, please just add them into the chat and we'll come to as many as we can at the end. So I'll hand over to Elliot.
Thanks, Francesca. That was a wonderful introduction and a way to frame today's conversation. It's fantastic to see many familiar and new faces. I'm going to dive in by saying if there's only one thing you pick up from my intro, it's sort of setting the history and the context for how we're getting to readiness for national packaging reform. It's this movement towards national harmonisation, how to align the states under a banner that we termed and kindly gave to Murray Watt's office earlier this year on one country, one system. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through the history. There's so many amazing leaders in the room today who know the history, but for those that are sort of walking into this webinar trying to find out more, I'll just progress quite quickly through the history and then the context, and we'll jump into the main event, which is a conversation with Simon. So the voluntary era of a sort of 20 years from 1999 really set up this architecture under self-regulation by industry, but in short, it didn't deliver the outcomes. In 1999, the National Packaging Covenant was set up, this voluntary opt-in system with action plans. Then 2011, things got a little bit more real with the enactment, the legislation behind NEPM, and starting to really drive what reporting looked like. It became mandatory in 2017 from the 1st of July, with companies over $5 million placing materials on market needing to either comply with NEPM through national or state EPAs or the national framework under APCO. And then 2025, obviously 2018, we set the 2025 national packaging targets. Until 2020, the Recycling and Waste Reduction Act, that was one of Scott Morrison's big drives that got passed in 2020. So that's the very sort of a prolonged but short history of voluntary packaging reform. We all know that the system hasn't worked. The major sort of objectives we set in 2018, we failed to meet. So we only got 20% plastics recycling of the target of 70%. Recycled content hit 44%. Then in terms of the single-use plastic phase out, 46%. That's down on the target of 100%. So overall, 0 out of 4 targets were met. A real clear call and a demand for change. What does that mean now? So what's the process behind national packaging reform? Well, quite simply, November 2023, Environment State Ministers met with the Federal Environment Minister. At that time, it was Tanya Plibersek, and demanded that the Commonwealth step in and become the sort of national regulator to mandate packaging design standards. Many people will be familiar with DQ's formal consultation paper that went out in September 2024. Hundreds responded, and 2/3 opted in for option 3, which is a movement towards a national EPR system. February 2025, that was published. National packaging targets were met, and it was quite clear that the writing was on the wall for change and some level of harmonisation. What happened was a bit of silence. Often happens in politics with the May 2025 election, but momentum's picked back up in early 2026 with the state and the state environment ministers meeting Murray Watt, the new minister for the federal minister for the environment, and the communique being quite clear that we need to progress towards an intergovernmental agreement. So this is a sort of turning point. This is effectively why we're here today, talking about national packaging reform, because there's a clear movement towards harmonisation. And Simon's going to speak to what that looks like and when. But in short, the framework is being set up, and we hope to see an outcome in the second half of this year. The tailwinds, just very basic terms in terms of what an EPR is. In short, producer pays for packaging from design through to disposal. Mandatory reporting, obviously linked with recyclability and fees that are attached to it, and penalties for non-compliance. And the direction of travel, really, 60 major nations now have EPR policies. Not all EPR schemes are created equal. They're all very divergent and different. This is kind of the benefit of Australia being slow, that we get to nitpick what's worked around the world and what hasn't. What does this mean for brands? A lot of brands here on the call today. Well, effectively, it means you need packaging data across your supply chain for all your SKUs and the different material type. What Ed will speak about is how you manage mass movement and material. We'll come to that a bit later. Compliance becomes a reality, not just in one jurisdiction, but multiple jurisdictions with different regulations. And then obviously eco-modulated fees, so the discount framework applied to rewarding and incentivizing good behavior by choosing the right materials. Effectively, brands need reliable, auditable packaging data systems to avoid significant penalties. And penalties can be significant. Ed and I had a late phone call with a major drinks beverage company in the UK last night that are up for £47 million in year one of EPR fees in the UK. So that's the reality businesses across the world are now facing. And Australia may not be as severe, but it's heading in the direction of harmonisation. So I won't labour on about this, and we'll get the team to send out these slides after. But as I mentioned, 2/3 of our major trading partners do have an EPR or are implementing one. Obviously, UK's led the way with an EPR and pretty hefty, clear fees. Australia generally follows in the footpaths of the UK and Europe, so I think they'll be looking quite closely at what has worked and hasn't worked in the UK market. PPWR in the European Union is about to commence in a few months. That's creating extra burden and compliance. The state-by-state approach, the provincial approach in Canada, obviously China amending and introducing some recyclable plastic standards earlier this year. These are all really insightful pieces of data that policymakers in Australia will be ruminating over as they prepare for what a system in Australia looks like. We proposed a three-phase system and put it in front of Murray Watt's office earlier this year, just around getting the framework right in the next year or two, moving to very affordable small fees and phasing that in over the next couple of years, and then thinking about the eco-modulated framework going from there. I'm going to move on to the main event, a Q&A. So I'm just going to kill the slideshow, apologies, and invite Simon into the conversation because that's why we're here. So Francesca's done a fantastic introduction to who Simon is. I received a phone call from Simon a couple of months ago as we were preparing an open letter, a cross-industry open letter, and he's played a remarkable role at the sort of intersection of politics and industry, and a fitting first guest for the series we want to launch over 2026 for national packaging reform. So welcome, Simon. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
No problems. Nice to be here, Elliot.
I just want to kick off with starting at the top. So Minister Watt, as Francesca said, has signalled that national packaging reform will come in the next few months. What's your read of the political landscape, and what do you think will happen in the form of an initial announcement, and how quick that announcement will go to some form of legislation and obligation?
Yeah, well, your webinar today is quite timely because this afternoon there's a joint ministerial roundtable, and I'll read the title. I can't remember it off the top of my head because it is a bit of a mouthful. It's called Emerging Plastic Supply Chain Issues for the Food Industry and Opportunities for Packaging Reform. I think Minister Watt has been very smart in this regard because he's brought in the Industry Minister, Tim Ayres, and the Agriculture Minister, Julie Collins. So by bringing those in, he's taking it beyond the realms of just packaging reform and into a broader sphere of, let's say, sovereign capability. Because I think what is now recognised, particularly with global events going on at the moment, is that the manufacture of packaging and packaging reform is not just a sustainability issue, it's a sovereign capability issue. So that's it. That ministerial roundtable is being held this afternoon. They've invited the industry group leaders from across the different sectors. So you're talking dairy, you're talking agriculture, you're talking meat, plus packaging, recycling, you name it, they're there. I don't think we're expecting any significant announcement coming from that roundtable, other than perhaps a signal that we do need to progress packaging reform in light of global events in order to protect what Australia needs to do to build our supply chain resilience across the packaging sector. So I think that will be the first step. So Pact is a plastic packaging manufacturer and plastic recycler. We're one of the largest in Australia. What we and others in the sectors have been calling for is a strong signal from the government that packaging reform and EPR will happen with some sort of indicative timetable. Because what we are seeing and what we've seen over the last probably 2 years is that brand owners are more and more stepping away from perhaps adopting more sustainable packaging options and saying, look, we will do it if we need to, if we have to, if there's regulation. So I think that's where we're at the moment. To Murray Watt's credit, he spent last year ushering through environmental protection laws, which was his writing instructions from the Prime Minister. He's seen as a can-do minister, and he's articulated to us, to others in the sector, that this year he's focusing on packaging reform. But I think he really needs the support from across government to get it through.
Which is a perfect tie into my next question around the communique is quite clear. I think that energised a lot of the sector, a lot of us that have been calling for uniformity across the states. What is the sort of gap that traditionally exists from 2 sentences on a communique that's very tight and managed through to sort of policy outcome, and what can slow it down?
Yeah, so look, the intergovernmental agreements are not necessarily, they don't need to be that complicated if it's a matter of enacting federal laws. So, which in this instance doesn't necessarily directly impact the state. So sometimes you'll have an intergovernment agreement, for example, if you've got water management issues related to rivers that cross state boundaries, or if you're looking at funding arrangements or competition policy, for example. So in this instance, I think because we've had the states, and some states more vocally than others, such as New South Wales, pretty much saying to the government, look, you've got to get on with this. This is taking way too long. I think there'll be an appetite for them to do this relatively quickly And look, I'm hopeful that it will simply take the form of just an agreement which will say we will either, as states, mirror the federal legislation, or we'll defer to the federal legislation. So it depends. States more and more these days simply like to have their own legislation, but I'm not expecting them to go away and do, this is an opportunity for them to do their own thing. So that's what an intergovernmental agreement is designed to do, is to sort of remove that patchwork of policies and different legislation that will cause confusion at a federal level.
So just on the state and territory responsibility, if there is an intergovernmental agreement, the risk of fragmentation is low. You can't have one state, certainly one that's calling for more reform or one that's calling for less reform, walk away. So you can't end up with 5 states and 2 territories. So no state will be able to walk away from it. But there has to be a consensus.
Look, they all have to sign up to it. Unfortunately, they're not necessarily, legally binding per se. But once they sign up to it, it demonstrates the will of each state to actually adopt this kind of federal model.
Yeah, we've got to love living in a federated state system, don't we?
Yeah.
So in terms of the cross-sector alignment, Pact Group was one of many that signed our open letter a few months ago. We brought together retailers, recyclers, technology companies, and the ENGOs, the sort of Greenpeace, WWFs, and Boomerang Alliance. I'd just like to know, because I think it's a bit unusual sometimes, the coalition between sort of industry and the ENGOs, but I think it was quite clear we wanted to have a unified voice. How important are these sort of cross-sectional, cross-industry relationships and alignments for the political calculus?
Yeah, look, whenever any governments try and bring about new policies or new legislation, they do need to get the support, broad support. I think this is probably, look, I've not been in this sector for, decades and decades, but certainly from people I've spoken to, this is probably the first time that there is that broad support across different sectors. So when you're talking about, for example, the recycling sector and the packaging manufacturing sector, you've got elements of the retail sector, food and grocery, beverages and so forth. So they're not, there will still be sticking points, obviously, but I think there is broad agreement and that we do need to move down this path. And in fact, it was only a few weeks ago, Nestle came out and, they're a huge global company and pretty much said, look, we would broadly support this. Now, the reason some of those global brands do is because they operate in an EPR system in other parts of the world. Yeah. I think what you'll find is most companies simply want certainty.
Yep. Certainly something we've heard too. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, cost of living and its sensitivity on all forms of politics. The DQ consultation that I mentioned, sort of that 2/3 agreement and a push for full EPR, national EPR with fees, that now has political sensitivities about cost of living. How do you see the government navigating that tension? And do you think getting fees deferred will buy some political cover?
Look, I can only speak from the perspective of plastic packaging because that's the business that we're in. That said, there was some really good analysis done by commissioned by ACOR and APCO jointly. We were part of that as well. And what that analysis found is that the cost of packaging overall, so if you're looking across materials, in terms of the overall shelf price, if you like, is about 2%. Okay, so if I put that in perspective, if we look at, say, a milk bottle, high volume, low margin, this is sometimes used as a bit of a barometer for in politics is what, the cost of milk and bread, that sort of thing. So if we look at a cost of milk, a 2-litre bottle of milk, without naming any brands, but, let's just call it an own brand milk, is $3.55. I looked last night when I went to buy a bottle of milk. The cost of packaging, the packaging component of that is, let's say, less than 20 cents. So when you start thinking about, well, if we add on an EPR cost, it would be less than a cent, maybe depending on, how that might look, but around about 1 cent. So the cost is minuscule when you look at packaging. And obviously when the higher the price of the goods itself, that the packaging is not necessarily going to change in cost. So if a cost for a shampoo bottle is, let's say, 20 cents, but the shampoo costs $9, again, you're looking at an extra cent potentially. So I think we have to put that into perspective on the cost component and the impact to consumers. If you do, that said, I completely understand, and I think there are some sectors that are quite vocal about the cost of living impact to this, and I understand that. And I don't think it's any secret. I know there was a dairy company that came out and spoke about this. I completely understand that, because the cost to them will be much larger, and they're in a very competitive environment. I come from an area where I remember the milk wars, the milk price wars. So I think I understand that, but if we then translate that to the cost to consumer, it's negligible.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
One more point. I think there is, that said, and I mentioned it earlier on, we're now in an environment where we are seeing, because of the global conflict, Iran conflict, we've also had COVID, we've had other supply chain disruptions. I think we're seeing, certainly politically, at all levels, across all parties, an appetite to be much more focused on that sovereign capability. Now, if I look at in our area, resin prices, for example, they've doubled as a result of the conflict in Iran. So it's now a lot cheaper to use domestically manufactured recycled resin than imported virgin resin. So there are issues that we need to kind of factor in all of this, rather than just focus on, the impact of cost of living.
Yeah, so cost is one part. Our workings were 0.1% in terms of not the cost of packaging, but the cost of an EPR, modelled on the back of UK with a smaller pass-through rate. On a $220 average grocery shop, you're talking about 20 to 25 cents. So it is negligible. Costs are costs. I like your opinion on what people care about. How's the money spent? Because if it goes to good solutions, if it goes to the right infrastructure, if it goes to good outcomes and achieves targets that we haven't as a nation, the input doesn't matter as much. So what would you sort of convey as a good outcome for how to spend the income from a future EPR nationalised scheme?
I think we're all in furious agreement on this one, and that is, it cannot go into general government revenue. And I think this is why you have to have, whether it's an APCO or an APCO-like body, as an independent scheme administrator. And they will be responsible for then how those fees are then put back into the system. So it might be, for example, if there is a need to increase, just, for argument's sake, recycling infrastructure for the dairy sector, which will help reduce the cost for the dairy sector, well, so be it. Then that's what we need to look at. If it's more manufacturing capacity, or if it's more assistance for farmers, or if it's for development of more lightweight milk bottles, which will reduce the freight fees and so forth. So there, I think, as long as it goes back into the ecosystem of packaging and recycling, that's fine.
Yep, great. You started that answer talking about APCO, so I'll go a bit deeper there. APCO has been the centerpiece of the voluntary system over the past 2 decades. I think we can all applaud the last sort of 3 or 5 years, how much work they've done to really make this a national issue and put it in front of consecutive federal environment ministers. What role do you see APCO playing in a mandatory system as we move beyond voluntary? And is there any political appetite for a public administrator or even co-regulator?
I think the last thing we'd want to see would be a bureaucratic administrator. It would become a nightmare. The role of government in all of this under legislation is to be enforcer. So I think you mentioned earlier on penalties being imposed on companies that don't comply. I think we all agree that, whether it's an APCO or an APCO has its supporters and detractors. I think many of the detractors exist purely because the national packaging targets and the lack of drive to achieve them. That said, I'm very sympathetic because they didn't have any powers. They were a toothless tiger. So I think we really would like, and I think Chris Foley has done a terrific job since he's taken over that role. So and they've got a lot of expertise, they've got a lot of corporate knowledge. So I think it'll be a shame to lose that. How it's set up under a regulatory framework, I'm not sure, but I do think that they will have some form of role to play, be it as APCO or an APCO-like body.
Yeah, I think that's a fitting answer. I'm keen, Simon, to unpack sort of the domestic versus international pressures, and it's not binary. It's not one or the other. It's the connection between the two. But I'd love to know, especially with the UK rolling out its EPR this time last year. I've mentioned Europe moving towards the PPWR later this year. How do you see that sort of tussle and our transition towards national packaging reform between global trade alignment with our major partners? Is that driving the political urgency versus the domestic waste and recycling failures?
Look, I think it's the latter, Elliot. I think it's much less to do with trade alignment and much more to do with domestic policies and priorities. So we're a net importer of plastic and packaging overall. We have waste export bans. So, for example, in plastics, you can't export PET plastic unless it's fully processed. We don't tend to export a lot of packaging. There's a bit of cross border trade with New Zealand, but and there might be some products and things that go up to China. But in the main, our packaging is manufactured for domestic consumption. So you articulated it well earlier on when you said that we do have the benefit of cherry picking the best from international experience, and I think very much so. They're looking at the EU and what's happened in the UK. The UK, their first crack at it was a bit of a failure when they introduced the plastics tax. It was not framed correctly, and all it resulted in, it was set at a too low a bar, and so all it resulted in was people saying, well, it's cheaper for me to pay this tax than it is for me to make sustainable packaging. So look, I think very much they're focusing on the domestic issues, and as I said earlier, I think now Murray Watt has an opportunity to go beyond just it being a sustainability initiative and taking it more into securing Australia's sovereign capability.
I'm keen to go back into the sort of political decision making of this reform, and when we're talking about reform too, I mentioned the RAW Act earlier because the expectation is it will be an amendment to the RAW Act as opposed to a new piece of legislation, which is obviously a bit more politically complex. From a government relations perspective, in your opinion, who are the key decision makers and influencers in the process beyond Murray Watt right now? And where do you see industry playing a role in directing its engagement right now?
Yeah, look, I think Tim Ayres, the industry minister, is pretty important in all of this. I've attended functions where he's very much talked about building Australia's domestic, or rebuilding, if you like, domestic manufacturing capacity. So there is that appetite there. Look, if you can get into Jim Chalmers' ear, he and also ultimately the Prime Minister. But look, I think there are some other kind of people on the fringes who are worth talking to. So for example, if I look at, I know he's retiring, but Senator Peter Whish-Wilson, and he introduced a private members bill recently, or just last week, on EPR. But the committee is chaired by a Labor senator, Senator Varun Ghosh. There's Michelle and Andaraja. So they're I guess these backbenchers or people on committees, because ultimately this will need to go before caucus, the broader Labor caucus. Now they'll support it, but ultimately then up into cabinet. So if there are any cabinet ministers that who people have any dealings with, then that's always worthwhile. There are other senior people within the Labor Party. So, for example, former Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, who is very close to the Prime Minister. So I think it's really a matter of any local members, any people that you might have any interest in discussing issues with, or you have cause to discuss issues with. From a non-Labor perspective, some of the Teals are worthwhile talking to. Kate Cheney over in Western Australia, she's very supportive. Sophie Scomps is also another one. Then I think the issue is it's not, Labor doesn't have an issue getting it through the lower house. It's getting it passed by the Senate. So now, in terms of the coalition, look, they're a bit all over the place at the moment. They've had, I think I probably like you, Elliot, I've engaged with 3 environment spokespeople over the last couple of years. So half of the time we have to bring them up to speed. But what's interesting is they do have Andrew Hastie, who has the portfolio of I think it's industry and sovereign capability. So I think he'd be a very interesting one. Look, my read is that the opposition are unlikely to stand in the way of this, simply because they don't have much in the way of green policies, which are, on that in that portfolio, which are terribly palatable to the broader community. Nobody wants to can recycling and sustainable packaging. So I think it's worthwhile talking to them on this, but at the right time. I think they'll wait to see what the policy and what the draft framework is. But look, I think anybody in the Labor Party you can speak to, and then at the right time, I think some of these people in the coalition.
So I'm going to wrap this up with 3 very quick-fired questions. You can answer with 1 word or 1 sentence. Pete, you mentioned Peter Whish-Wilson's private members bill last week. Does that help or hinder Labor's case?
Look, I think on one hand, it actually helps. It's in the realm of Parliament. We'll be able to get a bit of an understanding from look, people have made submissions on these things before. I think what's good is that we've got to have submissions in by 15 June and it's reporting back by 6th of August. So that's pretty quick turnaround. I don't think it'll hinder. I think
I'll take that as a help. What's your confidence on national packaging reform landing in 2026, percent-wise?
Oh, I'm very anti-gambling, Elliot, so I won't put a percentage on it. Look, I had hoped that we would see this at least a draft in the first half of this year. I'm less optimistic about that. However, I think if anyone can get it done this year, it will be Minister Watt, so long as we see something early in the second half.
Just for the record, as a son of the head of the anti-gambling task force, I wasn't asking you to place a bet there. I should clarify that, but I'll take that as strong confidence. Last question then, what's one thing brands should do now to get ready for change?
Look, from a plastic packaging perspective, but also across materials. Let's not forget this packaging reform is for all packaging materials in the sort of consumer goods space. So I think start to prepare, start to look, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And certainly for brands that haven't started to make that transition, you do need to take time to do your testing, to understand what the capabilities are for recycled content in your packaging.
That's great. We'll be back with Simon in a moment. Francesca's going to lead a Q&A, and I think it's a nice opportunity for everyone to start thinking about your questions and putting them in the chat. I'm just going to introduce Ed Whitehead, who's going to take us through what brands should do now, which is a nice segue from Simon's last answer. So over to you, Ed.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking the time. Who's in charge of the deck, guys? Please, thank you. I'm just going to speak briefly. I'll try and keep it to maybe less than 5 minutes, just to quickly talk you through what I think it is you guys should be doing. No one wants to follow a politics masterclass. Great job, Elliot and Simon. There was some really insightful thoughts and comments in that. I think what we're going is from this sort of voluntary to this regulatory space. The questions change. Are we reporting and improving? It's kind of changing to kind of, we need evidence, we need data, we need information. And I think this is the key thing to understand. That's the main shift. And the accuracy of data, the evidence that supports that data now becomes more critical, because there's a very distinct measure and there's a cost associated with it. Just coming to the conversation we had yesterday in the UK. Yeah, you can go, that's all good. You know, they have an outcome, they have some data, but the truth is they don't know how to mitigate that cost because the confidence in their data is actually not that good. So having confidence in the data will enable you to manage the process more effectively. And it was a really interesting learning listening to those guys, and that's something that, you know, we can probably help them with. So this is kind of slightly removed, and I've actually gone one step further when thinking about EPR. I consider EPR one policy amongst many, and the direction of travel for Australia, if you take a slightly longer horizon, is the movement towards product data in addition to movement of goods. So yes, we need to manage packaging and materials and recycled content. We need to evidence those sources, but we also need to where they came from. We need to understand what that makeup was. And as part of this overall data collection, we have to, I would say, if we're going to go to the effort of doing it, we're not collecting for compliance. We're collecting to build out a very significant data asset inside of your businesses, which we can repurpose for commercial advantage over an extended period of time. And compliance becomes part of the thing that you do with that data. We know that there's value to be found inside of these portfolios, so we're very positive about that. And that's something that we spend our time at Phantm thinking about all the time. So don't just get ready for EPR. We have to get ready for what comes past EPR, and I think that's quite transparent, and happy to talk to anybody about that as we move forward. And just the last one from me is, how do we go about it? So it's discovery. So we just work with customers to discover what their data look like. Once we've done some discovery, we go through that, prioritize the data. So where are the biggest problems? We optimize those elements first, and then innovation comes after that. Well, they're the 2 or 3 steps that you take as soon as you start having visibility of the data. One thing we've realized working with lots of our customers, they don't have a lot of data in some instances, so we help capture that data, and we have repeatable processes to achieve that. Structure it and enrich it. So the structure is really key, because yes, that supports your compliance, but the truth is we need it to support your commercial advantage, and which comes through optimization. So the key to how we approach data or packaging materials is the data structure, cannot be understated. And then once we've done all those things, we have that in a nice, easy place for you to access. It's then how we report and improve. So, and now it's evidence-based. We change something, what is the evidence that we have to support that change? And let's capture this all in one place. We see it so many times that businesses are driven by individuals collecting this data for a purpose, a moment in time, and then it kind of vanishes and that person leaves. So we have to build out an asset that has an existence inside the business, like financial reporting, because that's where this is now moving to. It's removing to that financial reporting space as well. So just be prepared and take advantage. It feeds into Simon's last comment, which is those companies that are prepared will be able to take advantage of what's in front of them. Don't be in a situation where you get the bill and go, hold on a minute, how did we arrive to this number? You need to know a long time before that. And then the other mindset is the other side of that is let's track, and again, to Simon and Elliot's part of that conversation is what's happening to the money that I'm spending through EPR and so on and so forth. And I think that's important to understand as a business, because you want to make sure it's impacting your portfolio quite specifically, because over time, EPR in combination with other policies will ultimately deliver, hopefully, a reduction in costs. So it's an evolving policy. It should change, it should iterate as we improve the systems. It's about getting the system started. So the last part of that is as well is, and I think it is a market access piece. And I know that I was played down in the conversation between Elliot and Simon. I understand that the focus is domestic, but increasingly, your overseas suppliers, for example, we mentioned that we're a net importer of things, are also kind of exporting to other markets that do have EPR. So us aligning actually does help everybody, because we're all kind of working to a similar standard. Otherwise, you might be getting increases in cost because other countries are aligning to a standard, for example. So there's lots of things to consider. So being aware of the policy and how it impacts the global market is kind of key. I've gone very fast because I'm mindful of time and any questions that we might have. So I'll leave it at that, but happy to talk to anybody and go through that at a different pace.
Thanks for that, Ed. I think a really important takeaway from both you and Simon's last comments is around identifying those gaps. And that's going to be the real benefit for businesses in trying to get ready, is how can they kind of go on that journey to have visibility around what their problems are going to be as soon as reform is kind of identified. We've got some time now to hand over to a little Q&A. So if you have any questions for Elliot, Simon, or for Ed, please just pop them in the chat, and we can get Q&A going. I think just while we wait as well, I had a question around, I guess, the idea of getting ready and how can businesses pursue that internally with leverage when packaging reform is not exactly clear yet. I wonder if maybe, Simon, that's one for you. What can businesses do at the moment to kind of pursue those outcomes while we don't have clarity around packaging reform?
Pursue regulatory outcomes or their own brand outcomes?
Their own outcomes. So as the regulation is going to become more clear in the coming months, how do they kind of create momentum internally to get ahead of those changes?
Yeah, okay. I think, look, as I said, it's from a plastic packaging perspective, it's not just a matter of, so for argument's sake, if we're looking at, if we're making and I'll just use a milk bottle. For those that don't know, there are different types of plastic resins that you use for different types of packaging. So for a milk bottle, it's HDPE resin. So if under EPR, there is a requirement that you incorporate, let's say 20% recycled plastic resin, HDPE resin, into your packaging, it's not just a matter of switching that out. It's not just a matter of saying, okay, we were using 100% virgin resin, now we're going to use 80% virgin resin and 20% recycled resin. So you have to ensure that your manufacturer has the right equipment to do it in the first instance. So there's blending equipment. And you also have to undergo testing to make sure that there is structural integrity. Most brands have issues with colour for their packaging. There's food safety requirements. Now, they're all things that we currently do, and there are, as I said, we currently make milk bottles with recycled material in it. But if you are moving down that path for the first time, it will take some time, though. So that testing does take time, because you might need a different type of bottle, you might need a different type of closure for it. So all of these things take time. So I think probably the time for those brands that haven't, as I said earlier, haven't embarked on that journey, it's certainly time to start investigating that. And then if you've already sort of embarked on that journey, start talking to your suppliers, I think, to make sure that they have the capacity and the capability to supply your packaging that might meet those requirements. I think it's also, clearly if there might be some types of packaging that won't be able to meet those requirements for whatever reason. So it's important that you do engage with government. I think the people at DQ, even though the department can be accused of being a bit slow, they do have a lot of knowledge in there, and it is their role to sort of start to consider all the factors in this.
Perfect, thank you. We've got a question here for the panel. What can brand owners do to help support the regulatory outcomes that we've been talking about here? So as a brand owner, how can you kind of support these changes as they're still being formulated?
I can help there. Well, we don't work with Pact Group. I'm just going to be honest there. We've only aligned ourselves with Simon in the last few months because our interests, like a lot of the industry, are aligned. It's been quite difficult to get brands to publicly call for national packaging reform, which I understand, including a lot of our customers. They sort of usually do so through industry associations. So your, APCO's one vehicle. You've got Australian Recycling Retailers Council, ARC, which is a former NRA and ARA that's come together. AFGC, a lot of those groups is generally where they're championing. We always support what we've heard from Minister Watt's office, and I know Jack is here from Peter Wilson's office. Having brands like KitKat, who came out a few weeks ago and popped their head above the parapet and say, this is good for industry, this is good for recycling, this is good for better design standards, does help. And we partnered with PAC again on some messaging in the Daily Telegraph today, just to encourage the national conversation to go forward. And I did go out to a number of major brands. I know it's hard. Our timelines are very short, working with media. The open letter, we're grateful to have Mecca's support and a few other brands. But for those that are willing and able to raise their voice or raise their profile and have visibility, I think that's a huge role that can be played, and then also be a part of the national conversation to drive it too.
Thanks, Elliot. This is a question from Marsha about whether or not our product might be able to help with California packaging regulation. So as you guys all spoke about earlier, there are a number of different global packaging regulations. I think in the US, they have a state system. So all different states have differing regulation, which is what we're hopefully going to move away from in Australia. So maybe Ed, you can pick that one up. How might Phantom's product facilitate that?
Thanks, Francesca. SB 54, I think, is the plastic pollution regulation primarily. And I think, and there's two questions there. I noticed Francis Carter has also kind of asked the question in a similar vein. I'll do Francis's question first. So the question is around, is Australia considering the other EPR regulation schemes and trying to harmonise? I think the answer to that is it would be wonderful if they were. I think there is some reference to those other schemes around the world. Europe and the States is only emerging as a scheme more so. So there is some harmonisation, but it's not going far enough. And that's a very practical example that you've provided, Francis, which is around, like, there's a change in packaging for California or something like this. We're not there yet, is the honest answer, but we have to be aware of that. That's where I guess technology can play its part in kind of pointing to what's possible or what's likely in each market. And then the first part of Marcia's question was around the regulation specifically. So much of that is about understanding what's inside of your packaging. So from a material perspective, does it have recycled content? At what level? Where is it from? So that's kind of what the regulation is speaking to. So that is kind of coherent with the regulations that we'd be looking at putting in place in Australia. But it doesn't cover everything off. is the honest answer. So yeah, it's tricky. Six states, I think, in Australia, in the US are now on board with EPR, and that will increase. And they're all running slightly different systems. It's something Australia is desperate to avoid, and that's the whole kind of part of this conversation, because it does cause confusion.
Thanks, Ed. I just want to pick up on something else Frances mentioned in her question, which was around the removal of recycling symbol for soft plastics because they don't have the infrastructure to recycle that in California. And I think that raises a really good point around, should legislation be pushing for the improvement of recycling infrastructures, or should the way that these things are labelled harmonise with the current capabilities? And how should that cycle kind of play out? Because I think she's made a really good point there around there's a real discord between what is being put on packaging and what the capabilities of the industry are currently.
That's definitely one for Simon.
Thank you. No, that's a really interesting point, because when you talk about, and the government is looking at the labelling. So when they talk about the labelling, not just from a functional perspective, but also around recycling. So they're looking at the ARL in that as well. So there's a difference between something being technically recyclable and something that can be recycled at scale. So at the moment, you cannot recycle soft plastics in Australia at scale. So we saw that with the collapse of RedCycle, you know, and that's the soft plastic that was collected there was just the tip of the iceberg. So I think what they're, under the model they're looking at, no one's going to prevent you from putting soft plastics onto the market. But if there are no recycling systems if there's no collection system and at scale recycling systems, you will pay a higher fee for placing that on market. So, however, those fees will then go into the broader pot, which they might say, well, look, we desperately need some infrastructure to recycle soft plastics at scale, so let's invest in there, and through a grant system or whatever it might be. So I think that's kind of a long-winded way of saying, that the label will be one thing, but the fees will be really the driving mechanism to get the packaging into a more sustainable place.
Thanks, Simon. Another question here from Sarah. What are your thoughts on changing packaging from single-use to reuse systems, like a reuse and then recycle at end of life?
I can go really quickly, and then you can jump in, Ed, because I know we're coming to the hour. But reuse plays a really important role. If you look at the waste hierarchy, reduces at the top, then reuse, then recover. So we're spending a lot of time talking about the third step, which is recover, which is important. We need the Pact Groups and so many others to have the ability to collect and manage what's already on market, or that's already in circulation. But there should be a lot of focus on reduce and reuse as the first two steps, whilst we manage what's already in existence, and be able to pull those materials through to a second, third, and fourth life. So I think it's a really important part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'll just second that. Reuse is absolutely critical as we move forward, amongst other systems and systems change that we'll need to kind of mitigate some of these costs. I'll just add, it's a EPR, if nothing else, is creating these conversations. And I think that's kind of the point, isn't it? Like, it's making us all aware of what needs to be done. And yes, there's a cost burden potentially in the short or maybe medium to longer term, but there's also a solution. One thing we do know, talking to industry, there's lots of innovation that could be put in place as a consequence of a regulation, right? It gives that clarity and direction of travel around investment, and we can solve many of these problems. So we shouldn't go away from this feeling hopeless, right? It's actually an opportunity for us to improve the situation massively as we move forward. So I'll pass back to Francesca.
Thanks, Ed. And thanks to Elliot and Simon for answering those questions as well. I think I'll just really quickly wrap up, because I know we're just about to finish up, but thank you all so much for joining us today. And in particular, thank you, Simon. Your industry insights on that topic were invaluable. So yeah, really enjoyed hearing from you, and I'm sure all of our attendees feel the same. This is kind of the first we're doing in a series of webinars on packaging reform. So we've got another one coming up soon with Chris from TOMRA. So stay tuned for that one. Announcement should be coming out soon. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. If you have any questions or want to connect with any of the team, yeah, please reach out after the webinar, and have a lovely rest of your Tuesday.